What's up guys, welcome back to Deck Tech for Decks. I'm your host Caleb. If you guys want to support the channel, you can click on that whatnot link in the description down below. You'll get a free $15 whenever you sign up and you'll be supporting the channel. Additionally, you can become a patron. Not only is that the best way to support the channel, but you'll get to vote weekly on a deck tech for me to cover. Special shout out to my high contributing patrons. Newsome, you rock. Now let's get into today's deck tech with Imskir. And this guy's going to be extremely abusable. Now he enters the battlefield and draws us cards equal to half the amount of artifacts we control, and then we're gonna lose life equal to half the amount of artifacts we control as well. What makes this guy abusable is he actually has affinity for artifacts, so even though he costs a ton of mana, we're going to be easily only paying RAKDOS for this guy, and then we can abuse his high mana cost by using our burnt offering or sacrifice effects to instantly add a ton of mana to our mana pool, and then we just cast him again to draw more cards. Now the perfect card in this deck, I know you don't want to hear it because it's kind of expensive, is Shieldred, because now whenever we draw cards we're going to be gaining life, so that's going to completely negate the life loss of this commander. He also has an ability to go ahead and sacrifice a high CMC artifact creature to deal damage to any target, so giving this guy a lifelink is another solid way we can kind of mitigate the fact that we're going to be losing a lot of life in this deck. And that kind of leads me to the other part of this deck. We're just going to be playing some high CMC artifact creatures that are going to deal a ton of damage when we sacrifice them. I'm talking about our Phyrexian Tritiform effects. We're on our Triplicate Titans. We have Wormcoil Engine, and we even have a new kind of Wormcoil Engine effect with the Wormcoil Larva. So now we have a lot of things we can loop in and out of the graveyard with our Goblin Welder effects. We're also going to be on Goblin Engineer. This guy's just an insane value engine piece. And then we're also on Goblin Scrap Welder. These are the glue that's going to stick this deck together. We're going to throw all of these high CMC artifacts in our graveyard, reanimate them, sacrifice them with our commander, and just generate a ton of value. Especially when we have effects like Ruthless Technomancer, right? We sacrifice our commander once, we have 5 treasure tokens on the battlefield, then we cast him again. We're probably drawing upwards to 5 cards because we already had artifacts on the battlefield, right? So this deck can just draw a ton of cards. It's going to be amazing Rakdos value where we just sacrifice high CMC commanders and artifact creatures to take away the game. So if that sounds like a deck tech you want to get into, let's get into it. Let's talk about the Goblin trio that are going to be the main value engines of this deck. We have your Goblin Engineer, your Scrap Welder, and your Goblin Welder effects. First thing we're going to talk about is the Goblin Engineer value engines. We have your Brass's Tunnel Grinder and Altar of the Wretched. These are amazing pieces to loop in and out of our graveyard. We can use Altar of the Wretched to sacrifice our commander. Not only is that going to fill our graveyard, but additionally, it's just going to draw us a ton of cards. And then we're using Brass's Tunnel Grinder to discard all of those cards and draw even more cards. So this deck can rifle through the library very efficiently. Then we have the Wretched Bone Mass, so we can actually turn this over, exile all of those high CMC artifact creatures from the graveyard, and then we have a massive creature that we can do whatever we want with. We can sacrifice it to Ruthless Technomancer to generate an insane amount of mana. If we have Terror of the Peaks on the battlefield, this is just going to do a ton of damage whenever it enters the battlefield. This card's just incredibly flexible in the deck. Cursed Mirror, also very good in this deck as well, since we can turn it into any of our big artifact creatures already on the battlefield, while also using it to loop with our Goblin Engineer since it's only 3 CMC. From there, let's talk about how we're going to utilize Goblin Scrap Welder. This is kind of the one we want to utilize after we filled our graveyard with those massive creatures. Now we can loop stuff like Triplicate Titan and Phyrexian Tritiform to generate a massive board of artifacts, and again, if Terror of the Peaks is on the battlefield, this will do a ton of damage very quickly. Wormcoil Engine and Wormcoil Larva, again, solid things to loop in and out of the graveyard, and they can gain us some life, so that's going to again mitigate the life loss from our commander. Mirror Battlesphere, another amazing thing to loop in and out of the graveyard. We have your Ruin Grinder. This can not only fill our graveyard, but it's solid card advantage. Portal to Phyrexia, loop that a couple times, and your opponents are just going to scoop on the spot. Definitely the better of the two, but it definitely does require more setup. You also have Necron Deathmark. Looping this in and out of the graveyard, getting rid of our opponent's key pieces can also be very useful. I'm also on Thornbite Staff in this deck. Definitely watch this card. It's probably not okay because once you get this on a Goblin Welder, you can just loop 2 creatures in and out of the graveyard infinitely, but it does also synergize with our Goblin Engineer and Goblin Scrap Welder effects. Just untapping a Goblin Engineer every time you sacrifice a creature is incredibly powerful, and it's not necessarily infinite. It's also worth noting we're on biotransference here, so now we can kind of loop anything in and out of the graveyard regardless if it's an artifact or not, because now it is an artifact. It's also just going to populate the board, really reducing the cost of our commander. Then let's talk about Scrap Welder. Now this guy isn't your engineer and he's not your welder, but he is very useful, right? Because now we're sacrificing something like a Phyrexian Triniform to bring something like a Wormcoil Engine back from the graveyard. And then the next turn, Wormcoil Engine can grab your Wormcoil Larva, and then your Wormcoil Larva can grab your Mask of Grizzlebrand, or really whatever you need, your Brass's Tunnel Grinder, Altar of the Wretched. It's just a very flexible card. You just need to make sure you're sacrificing more than what you're bringing back. We're also on, again, Mask of Grizzlebrand. That lifelink is going to be pretty useful, and then it's just very good to go ahead and pay 3 mana, equip this to a Phyrexian Triniform that we probably didn't pay for, sacrifice that Phyrexian Triniform to bring, again, your Triplicate Titan back, and you're just going to lose 9 life and draw 9 cards in the process. That is definitely a good trade up. Moving on the cards that really synergize with the commander, we have Heragast. This is amazing, giving all of our creatures a merge. So now we can easily cast our commander, sacrifice our high CMC commander to cheat something like a Wormcoil Engine or Phyrexian Triniform into play for almost nothing, and then we can just go off from there because we can easily recast our commander for 2 Rakdos. So with Heragast on the battlefield, it kind of turns into cheat all of your giant creatures into play, like kind of a sneak attack effect. It's really good. Sheoldred the Apocalypse, again, whenever we're drawing all these cards, we are losing life, so it is worth having a solid life gain option in the deck to mitigate all of that life we're losing, and Sheoldred's going to be the perfect option. Psychosis Crawler, unironically, can kind of win us the game. We're drawing a ton of cards, we just have to kill our opponents. So whenever our opponents are taking 1 life for each card we draw, when we have the opportunity to draw upwards to 40 cards a turn, that is just going to be lethal. RAKDOS the Muscle. Now, I wouldn't recommend using this on your own library because, again, you have a lot of high CMC key pieces, but being able to use this on our opponent's library is very useful, especially when we're on our Sacrifice and Burnt Offering effects, right? That's just going to give us 8 mana straight to our mana pool, and we don't have to worry about the color cost with RAKDOS. So we sacrifice our commander that's 8 CMC, add 8 mana to our mana pool, and then look at the top 8 cards of someone's library. That's extremely powerful. This guy slots in perfectly in the deck. Greven, Praetor Captain, kind of paired perfectly with the losing the life and drawing the cards portion of the deck. So with Sheoldred on the battlefield, this guy puts in insane work, draws us a ton of cards, and honestly, hits like a truck. Ruthless Technomancer is just amazing in this deck. We want to be sacrificing something massive like our Triplicate Titan, but even if we're sacrificing something like a Wormcoil Engine, it's very good here. Just gets a lot of artifacts on the battlefield, and it is very flexible recursion, right? Pitiless Plunderer, we are sacrificing a ton of creatures, and a ton of our creatures just so happen to die out of nowhere. So getting a treasure token off of that's going to be incredibly useful. Braid's Arisen Nightmare, sometimes we need a sack outlet for our commander because we just want to cast him again, and that's completely fine. So Braid's Arisen Nightmare is going to be perfect in this deck. Terror of the Peaks, again, it's no surprise why we are running this. We're sacrificing massive creatures and bringing back massive creatures. So whenever you have like a Phyrexian Triniform effect on the battlefield and you just sacrifice that for a Triplicate Titan, that's going to be a total of 3 damage per 3/3 golem, right? So that's 9 there, and then 9 from the Triplicate Titan. You're dealing 18 damage every time you sacrifice Phyrexian Triniform to bring back a Triplicate Titan. That's kind of insane. Chiscoria is perfect in this deck. It has affinity for artifacts, and then it gives the spells you exile affinity for artifacts as well. Now, we will lose some of our key pieces to this guy, but at the end of the day, we're going to be able to cast some massive stuff off the top of our library using him. Fable of the Mirror Breaker seemed pretty solid here. Now it generates some treasure tokens in the early game. We can discard our massive creatures to the graveyard, but honestly I really like Reflection of Kiki Jiki because we can create a token copy of a Triplicate Titan and then it sacrifices itself at end step. That way we can get the die trigger. So it's just perfect in the deck. We don't have to do the whole Goblin welding looping in and out, and we're just going to get that massive board state of those 3/3, golems. Othorion and Feldon do exactly the same thing here, reanimate massive creatures or go ahead and create token copies of them, and then whenever they die, boom, we get their die trigger. Othorion can kind of be a flat win con in this deck as well. If you have Terror of the Peaks on the battlefield and you go ahead and spend 9 mana to create 5 token copies of Terror of the Peaks, that's going to be a total of 125 damage, since every single Terror of the Peaks will see the other enter the battlefield. So again, 9 mana, Terror of the Peaks on the battlefield, you do just win the game with these two. And that's not really a pipe dream whenever we're on your sacrifice or burnt offering effects and our commander is 8 CMC. We're also on Slow Bad and Illuminar Zaras, so in a scenario where we turn our commander into an artifact, we can easily sack him for, again, 8 mana to spend on whatever we want. So it's not hard to get insane amount of mana in this deck. That of Rebirth pairs perfectly with treasure tokens, right? Sacrifice 3 treasure tokens, you get all the oil counters you need to then reanimate a creature from your graveyard. You do need one other death in there, but that's not hard to do. Chainer Nightmare Adept is amazing in these reanimator style decks. A lot of people miss the fact that the haste ability just cares about them being reanimated or not cast from your hand, right? So even if we reanimate something with a Goblin Engineer, that is going to get haste. So now we have a solid way to recur our key pieces while also giving our Phyrexian Triniforms haste before we sacrifice them. AR is going to slot in perfectly here. Not only does she go absolutely insane with Thornbite Staff because we cast our commander for RAKDOS, go ahead and sacrifice him, dome someone for 8, and assuming Thornbite Staff is attached to Ayara, that will untap her. So we're just going to keep drawing into more cards and doming everybody for 8 every time we do this, and then the life gain we get off of Ayara mitigates the life loss we take off of our commander. And then late game, if we need more bodies, we just flip Ayara and she turns into a solid reanimation piece. Notably, the exile effect is a non-bow, but this is one of the only exile effects that if you're able to sacrifice your creature you reanimate before the end step, it'll actually still die and go to the graveyard. Basilisk Collar, Shadow Spear, Luxodon Warhammer, Phyrexian Flesh Gorger, Witch's Clinic, all solid cards to again help mitigate our life loss from the commander. Remember, our commander does have that ability to sacrifice an artifact to deal damage to any target. So now, whenever a Luxodon Warhammer is equipped to him, we're actually going to gain that life because he does deal the damage. Sneak Attack's perfect in this deck. You just throw your giant Phyrexian Tritoform onto the battlefield, it dies, and then you get those 3/3/3s. Scrap Trawler, amazing in this deck as well. This is going to ensure that you always have your key pieces in your hand, especially when we turn all of our permanent cards into artifacts, right? So now whenever something like a Phyrexian Tritoform dies, we can easily reanimate something like a Basilisk Collar, Luxodon Warhammer, Vat of Rebirth, Thornbite Staff, anything we need at the time, we can bring it back to our hand. Breach the Multiverse is kind of just in this deck since we have a way to generate a ton of mana and it kind of instantly fills our graveyard. It's not hard to see where we can easily cast our commander turn 4, even maybe turn 3 with the right hand, and then cast a sacrifice netting 8 mana instantly, then straight into Breach the Multiverse, right? So we don't get punished that hard for running these high CMC cards. Reckless Endeavor, again, very high CMC, but we're going to get a pseudo board wipe that does generate more treasure tokens. So it's not hard, again, sack the commander for a ton of mana, wipe the entire board, cast the commander again, while drawing a ton of cards. Bottle Cap Blast, perfect here, generate some treasure tokens, take out a creature while we're doing it. Anger slots in perfectly in these decks. We're running a lot of Seize the Spoils, unexpected windfall effects. That way we're drawing cards, discarding cards while generating treasure tokens to reduce the cost of our commander and turn into card draw later. So having things to discard into the graveyard that just give us haste slots in perfectly. And let's be honest, you already knew this, but we are running the Reaver Cleaver in this deck as well. It's just too good not to include. You connect with a Phyrexian Tritoform, you go ahead and add 9 treasures to your mana pool, cast your commander, draw a ton of cards, and then the treasures are now able to cast the cards that we draw. It just kind of creates a Corvold imitation, and any time we're doing something that imitates Corvold, we're doing something pretty powerful. That's going to do it for the deck tech, guys. Hey, if you guys want to see this Nadu deck tech that's kind of messed up, probably not okay for casual, just because this is probably the most broken Simic commander we've gotten since Kitten, go ahead and click that link above. With that being said, I would like to thank my patrons, Newsome, Excessum, Chicken Salad, and Praetor. You guys are amazing. I hope this helped you guys in your deck building endeavors, and I will see you guys in the next one.